Welcome to our Proverbs class on Wednesday nights, or if you're watching this on any other time, we thank you for tuning in and hope this can be helpful to anybody that's watching at any time. And as I have said before, we have material for this Proverbs class available on our website at www.belairchurchofchrist.org under Bible class material, which I believe is under the media tab. And so there's a PDF there with all of the lessons. And if you are jumping in on this study and would like to see the previous studies, they are on our Wednesday night Bible class playlist on the YouTube channel. And these premiere each Wednesday night through the fall of 2020. And so we invite you to go back and watch and join us in the future if you can do that. So let's jump in to looking at our schedule and to our lesson tonight. We are on the fourth lesson in which we are seeking to give a more concrete definition to a term that we've been talking a lot about already, and obviously we'll continue to talk about, which is wisdom. And you see the rest of the classes there. And I will just point out briefly that there is a change. The elders of the church have announced that we will be resuming in-person Wednesday night classes on Wednesday, December 2nd. And so previously I had thought that we would use that to finish off this study, but since that's going to be the beginning of a new quarter and beginning of our in-person Bible classes, then we'll go ahead and do a review in the previous week, which is Thanksgiving week. And so I had thought maybe we wouldn't have class, but I think if that's going to be virtual anyway, then we'll go ahead and we'll do a Proverbs review virtually, like we're doing all the rest of these classes, on the week of Thanksgiving, and then just start with a fresh new quarter of classes on Wednesday, December 2nd. So that's the plan going forward, but let's talk about what we want to do in this specific class. We want to define wisdom. So basically by the end of the class, we should get closer to settling in on a specific definition of wisdom by looking at where wisdom comes from and what wisdom produces in one's life. And in doing that, we'll be able to more clearly contrast the wise person and the foolish person, which are kind of the two main characters, so to speak, in the book of Proverbs. Again, both of these things we have talked about. What is wisdom? What do we mean by that? What does Proverbs mean by that? And what does it mean to be wise? How do the wise people differ from foolish people? We've been discussing that, and we hope to nail that down even further in this lesson. So let's talk about the nature of wisdom and what it is. And we're going to begin with a little bit of a contrast even with wisdom, or an interesting mixture of ideas in which we see wisdom presented in a couple different ways, and we want to be aware of both of them and then talk about how they might fit together. The first thing we'll say is that wisdom is presented in the book of Proverbs as a commodity. Now, that's not a word that I use all the time. Maybe depending on your work and business, you might use the word commodity quite a bit. But a commodity is something valuable, a raw material perhaps, or something of value that can be traded. It can be bought and can be sold. And that exchange can be made, and you can possess it, and you can possess more of it, and you can store it up, or you could get rid of it if you wanted to. Wisdom is seen as that sort of object of value that can be bought, sold, traded, received, possessed, stored up. That's how wisdom is described in Proverbs. And so you notice some of the verses I put up here. Proverbs 2. If you accept my words, if you store up my commands within you, turning your ear to wisdom and applying your heart to understanding, indeed, if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, if you look for it as silver, search for it as hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. And so you see that comparison even to silver, to hidden treasure. Chapter 8 continues that comparison, that metaphor. Choose my instruction instead of silver, knowledge rather than choice gold. For wisdom is more precious than rubies, and nothing you desire can compare with her. So we see also the metaphor here in chapter 8, obviously, of Lady Wisdom, that we can invite into our lives as a companion. But we also see the metaphor of we're hoarding up silver, we're hoarding up gold, we're seeking out, we're desiring precious things like rubies. And the Proverbs writer says, no, seek for wisdom in that way, to treasure it, to value it so much that you would store it up and bring it into your life. And then an interesting statement in verse 23 of chapter 24, buy the truth and do not sell it, wisdom, instruction, and insight as well. I just mentioned this verse. I don't claim to be able to explain exactly all that means, but you see this description that wisdom is there, truth is out there, instruction and insight. It's available. It's on the market, so to speak. Buy it. Give up what you need to, but pay whatever you have to buy truth, to buy wisdom and instruction. And once you have it, don't get rid of it. Regardless of what may be offered to you in return, prize and treasure your wisdom and instruction so much that you don't want to get rid of it. Buy it and do not sell it. Interesting connection here to Matthew chapter 13 and what Jesus says about the kingdom of heaven being like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then his joy went and sold all that he had and bought the field. The man in Matthew, in the parable there, finds something of such great value that he just has to have it, and once he has it, he's not going to let it go. And wisdom is presented in that way in the book of Proverbs. And this makes sense, or is a natural way of thinking about wisdom in line with what we talked about last week, which is where wisdom comes from, the origin of wisdom. So remember this chart about God being the source of wisdom, and then he rains it down. He gives wisdom through his revelation to man. So we talked about direct revelation. We talked about the knowledge of God being revealed in the Bible, in the scriptures that we can then find for ourselves. But we also talked about how Proverbs is very clear that through all these other sources, nature, education, our experiences, wise people in our lives, parents, family members, mistakes that we make, mistakes that other people make, through these other sources, God is also giving to us, or offering at least to us, wisdom. And so wisdom is, in that way of thinking, a commodity. But wisdom is also described in another way that's a little bit different in the book of Proverbs, and that is that wisdom is also described as a character. That is, not so much something that you have as much as something that you are. Okay, so 23:24. The father of a righteous child has great joy. A man who fathers a wise son rejoices in him. So wise describes the character of the son. Wisdom is a character trait, character quality. Chapter 1, verse 5. Let the wise listen and add to their learning. Let the discerning get guidance. So it's interesting. Chapter 1 is talking about adding and getting, which is the language of commodity that we've just talked about. But the word wise itself is again used to describe the kind of person that the proverb writer is talking about. The wise person, the wise people will do such and such. And then chapter 18, verse 15. The heart of the discerning acquires knowledge. The ears of the wise seek it out. Again, seeking and acquiring. Who's doing this? Well, it's people that are wise. Okay. So wisdom is a characteristic that describes somebody. And that's different than wisdom being a thing that is out there that I can possess or get for myself as a commodity. So wisdom is a character. It is also a commodity. Let's think some about how those two things fit together. And we'll do that first by looking at the opposite of wisdom in the book of Proverbs, which is folly or the foolish person. So notice how Proverbs describes folly or describes the foolish person. This is from chapter 1. We start with 20 and 21 that describe how out in the open, wisdom calls aloud. She raises her voice in the public square. On top of the wall, she cries out. At the city gate, she makes her speech. So we're familiar with this picture because we read this in chapter 1 a few weeks ago. Wisdom is calling. Wisdom is inviting. But verse 24 and 25, but since you refuse to listen when I call, and no one pays attention when I stretch out my hand, since you disregard all my advice and do not accept my rebuke, and then the consequences are laid out in the following verses. So there are people out there who will not listen, who will not accept, who will not receive what is being offered to them, or listen to or accept wisdom. Chapter 17, verse 16. Why should fools have money in hand to buy wisdom when they are not able to understand it? Here's the marketplace metaphor again. Fools. It's a certain type of person that could get wisdom if they wanted to, but they wouldn't be able to understand it. They can't receive it because they can't understand it. In a similar way, 24 verse 7, wisdom is too high for fools. In the assembly at the gate, they must not open their mouths. So again, wisdom is out there, but there's a certain kind of person that can't receive it. It's too high for them. So folly itself is described as a character trait, right? You see the fools described here, especially in 17 and in 24. Okay? But the action of these people, the foolish action, is to not receive the wisdom, the advice, the instruction that is being given to them. And so what we might say is that that folly itself is a quality of character that expresses itself by rejecting the commodity of wisdom that is being offered to it. And so you see how that idea of folly brings together both the character quality of a foolish person. That's the kind of person that I am, okay? But the way that expresses itself, that folly manifests in the fact that I am pushing away or not receiving wisdom as a valuable commodity that I could otherwise benefit from. This is from your handout, A and 2, but there's one more verse on there, 28:6, that we'll see again. But it says that fools trust in their own hearts. Okay, so again, that's a nature of a person, trust in themselves. That's how Proverbs describes a foolish person, because in doing that, there is no room to receive the commodity of wisdom. Okay, so that is the contrast then. Let's think about how on the positive side we would define wisdom. What would you do? You have some examples there in number C on your handout of from different books and scholars and such, the way they have defined wisdom. But based on what we're seeing in Proverbs, how would you define it? And I'll give you one. But you have space on your handout. I encourage you to disregard my definition, to come up with your own definition, to tweak my definition, to talk with those around you about a better definition. But here's what I would say, and this is my effort to combine both wisdom as a commodity and wisdom as a character. That wisdom, according to Proverbs, is a skill. It's a skill of living well, and that skill of living well, living well. Let's say living good, but that's not grammatically correct. It's the skill of living well that comes from fearing God and humbly desiring to learn and grow. Okay, I missed a word there. There's supposed to be an and between Lord and humbly. Okay, that's what I get for editing it too much. Leave out words. The skill of living well that comes from fearing the Lord and humbly desiring to learn and grow. This is my attempt. Okay, I think the idea of a skill combines both of these pieces of what wisdom is. Okay, skill is something you gain. Right, we were familiar with that. Anything you do, playing the piano or writing a bike, anything like that. A skill is something that you gain. You can get more and more of it. Right. But wisdom, the skill of being good at life, living well, that skill is rooted in this attitude, this character trait, which is the fact that I fear the Lord. Fear the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and that I'm humble in the fact that I always want to learn. I know that the answers are not in myself, that they're out there, and I want to learn. I'm curious. I'm investigating. I'm wanting to not only gain information, but grow as a person, be better. And all of that is because of my fear of the Lord and so on and so forth. So it's a skill that comes from fearing God and desiring to learn and grow. Wisdom, the skill of living well, is something maybe we would say that you get better at it by getting better at it. Okay? Or the better you get at it, the easier it is to get better at it. So it grows on itself, it feeds on itself, if that makes any sense whatsoever. So it is something we gain, but we have to have a certain character quality in order to gain it. And that's what we're trying to get across. And I want to contrast this a little bit with what might be a common perception or a common notion that we would have about wisdom, which has to do with speaking and listening. So imagine a scenario where there's a bunch of people sitting around a table, okay? And you imagine that one of the people there at the table is really wise, okay? The super wise person is there. And in our minds, we imagine this super wise person sitting in a group of people. What are they doing? Okay? Are they speaking or are they listening? And I think sometimes we have a tendency to think that the wise person is the one who has all this good things to say, right? They just are so full of wisdom and they are saying all these things, talking and talking about all the things that they know. Well, that's not quite the primary picture of the wise person in the book of Proverbs. Instead, the emphasis of the wise person in the book of Proverbs is listening and learning and being quiet, so to speak. Okay. Chapter 18, the heart of the discerning acquires knowledge. The ears of the wise seek it out. Chapter 12, the prudent keep their knowledge to themselves, but a fool's heart blurts out folly. Sin is not ended, chapter 10, verse 19. Sin is not ended by multiplying words, but the prudent hold their tongue. You see the contrast here between wisdom and fools is not the wise person has so much to say. It's actually the opposite. That it is the fool that is blurting out, that is multiplying words. And as the fool multiplies words, sin is not stopped. I think some translations even say it's just continued through multiplying words. Whereas the prudent one keeps it in. Okay, even if he's thinking correctly, there's a reservation. There's a keeping it to themselves. There's an acquiring of knowledge before anything else, holding the tongue and not speaking. And you see how this fits with the definition of both wisdom and folly that we are working with. Okay, folly has no interest in receiving wisdom because there's something in the heart that says, "I trust myself and I want." I know all the answers and I have no need for any kind of instruction. That's folly. And so in the rejection of wisdom, they want to say their own opinion. Whereas if wisdom is a skill of living well that's all about fearing God and wanting to learn, then that wise person is going to listen before they speak, or only listen. And when they do speak, which they will, of course, wise people do speak, but the picture of the Proverbs, like in chapter 15, verse 28, the heart of the righteous weighs its answer. There's a contemplation, there's a measuring before speaking, as opposed to the mouth of the wicked that gushes evil. In verse 2 of the same chapter, the tongue of the wise adorns knowledge. So anything a wise person says it's kind of rare and it's precious, and it serves to adorn things that are true according to wisdom and knowledge. But again, the mouth of the fool gushes folly, and so you see this idea of a spring, right, that is just constantly bubbling over. That's what the fool is like, always speaking and never listening. Okay, this is a little bit of an aside, but it's interesting. It's one of those things that I have to get into a class on Proverbs because it's just too much fun to leave out. But I do think it illustrates some of the things that we are talking about. There are two verses in Proverbs 26 that seem to contradict, but they teach us something I think important about the Proverbs. Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, verse 4, or you yourself will be just like him. Verse 5, answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. So what do we make of this? Verse 4 clearly says, do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be just like him. I think we get this idea, okay? Don't even get involved in the argument, all right? Maybe Facebook is a great, example of this, okay? Don't even comment. Don't even get involved, because then you'll look just as foolish as everybody else that's involved in this pointless discussion, okay? So the wise person abstains altogether. But verse 5 says, answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. And maybe we get this too. We understand, sometimes, this person just doesn't understand what they're saying. And if you take them aside and you say, hey, look, this is the truth and this is what you're missing, then they'll see that and they won't continue in their error. But they're right next to each other, which is interesting. One says, don't answer the fool. One says, answer a fool. So what do we make of all of this? Well, most immediately to our discussion, we see again the way that a wise person goes about speaking. A wise person doesn't just speak, without thinking or just speak the same in every circumstance. The wise person considers the situation, weighs what's going on, measures his words, considers the outcomes in a situation, and then in that kind of skillful consideration then gives the answer or abstains from the answer according to what is fit. And so there's a skill involved here. Living well involves discerning how each situation must be different and applying what is best for that situation. That's the skill of living well, and how, particularly to what we've been talking about, how a wise person listens, considers, and then speaks as is necessary, in contrast to the fool who's just always going to be foolish no matter what, or always going to be speaking, gushing forth his opinion. But the wise person acts differently. But it also shows us something just much more generally important about the book of Proverbs, which is that Proverbs are they're different, as we've talked about in previous lessons, from these commandments, right? Of thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery. There is an advice, a counsel that's given in Proverbs about how to live. And many of these Proverbs, we have to understand how to apply them in the situation and understand that they are not guarantees with hard and fast, they are not rules with hard and fast guarantees. Instead, they are general pictures of how the world works and advice for how to navigate that based on the situation. So, how to answer a fool? Well, the wise person will listen, consider, and act as appropriate to the situation. Okay, again, that was kind of an aside, but just had to get it in there somehow. Okay, on your handout in number D, number 3, you have a two-column list here that contrasts the wise person and the foolish person. As is typical with these particular handouts for our Proverbs class, there's more information, more references on the handout than we have time to get to. And so you can either use the handout as a way to prepare and look at all these things ahead of time, which would be great. Or if nothing else, you can use these handouts afterward to look at more material than we had time to cover in the class and can benefit from studying and meditating on it that way. But look at the verses that are given to you on your handout, and then I will go through on the chart here and lay out what each of these verses or each of these places on the table is communicating. So, how would you compare a wise and a foolish person in relation to God? Well, we know that the starting point of wisdom for the wise person is the fear of the Lord. 9 verse 10, fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. On the other hand, the foolish person, this is borrowing a little bit from Psalm 14, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. So, either an express atheist Or maybe perhaps more to the context of Psalm 14:1, a person who lives as if God doesn't exist. God's not going to see this. God's not going to do anything about it. So a practical atheist that may say God exists but lives as if he doesn't. But that lack of recognition, that refusal to acknowledge God is the opposite of the wise person who says, no, I fear the Lord. I honor him. I live my whole life under his sovereignty. Okay? And so when it comes to the law, you have the verses there. The wise person sees law, sees commandment, which we have a tendency to buck against. He sees it as a good, helpful thing. He accepts it. He heeds it. He knows that in the law there is life and there is health and there is peace in following God's commands. Whereas the foolish person doesn't heed it. He just keeps blabbing away and chattering on, giving his own way of things as opposed to honoring God's law. When it comes to instruction and reproof, the wise person loves, well, it's hard, it's difficult to accept, but the wise person listens and accepts it. He sees it as an opportunity to grow whenever he is faced with instruction or reproof, as opposed to the foolish person who bristles when you try to tell him that something is wrong or that he's doing something in error or that he's missing something. They disregard, they reject that discipline. The wise person is always trying to store up knowledge. Any opportunity they can to learn, as we've just talked about, with reproving, accepting, that's a great thing for him because he's just trying to store up as much knowledge as possible. Whereas the the foolish person delights, chapter 18, verse 2, delights only in expressing his own opinion. That's just a perfect encapsulation of what we're talking about. Loves his way of living, loves his way of thinking, is going to tell you about it, always has an opinion, but never really wants to listen to anything that someone else has to say. When it comes to companions, a wise person walks with the wise, is trying to surround himself by people that are knowledgeable and wise and good and that also fear the Lord. Whereas the foolish person in chapter 1 verse 7 spurns wisdom and instruction, but remember that the rest of chapter 1 goes on to describe the foolish companions, and that's the picture of fools, that they like to surround themselves with other fools who are also like them, greedy for unjust gain and are resistant or are negligent of the consequences and don't want to be told how to live. Obviously, then when it comes to evil and sin, the wise person shuns it, he walks away, he hates it. This is a big thing for us to think about. When we see evil, we see wickedness, the wise person hates it and he shuns it and he resists it. Whereas the foolish person, interesting, in chapter 13, verse 19, it says, it's an abomination to turn away from evil. He can't help but go to evil. He wouldn't think about turning away from it because he desires it so much, or it's so much fun, or whatever else you would say about that. And then, as we've said, the foolish person trusts in himself. That's back to that 28 verse 26, trusting in his own heart. Whereas we'll see in a moment, chapter 3, the wise person does not lean on his own understanding and is not wise in his own eyes. Okay, real quickly, because we are running out of time, let's do a couple more things. One is to address, this is the back of your handout here, address the relationship between wisdom and the fear of the Lord in light of what we've been talking about tonight, which is this idea of a skill that helps you to get more of the skill, being wisdom. Notice these two passages here. Chapter 9, we've talked about this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. So fear of the Lord gets you wisdom. But notice chapter 2, verse 3 and 5. If you call out for insight, if you raise your voice for understanding, if you seek like silver and search for it as hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. So chapter 2 says that once you get wisdom and get insight, then you will understand the fear of the Lord. So it goes from wisdom to the fear of the Lord. It goes the other way. And so we have this kind of circular concept here that is always feeding on itself. That when we begin by respecting God as the creator of the world and seeking his wisdom, then we gain that wisdom. But what does that do? Among other things, it just reiterates, it grows, it increases our admiration for God and our respect for His wisdom and His world. And it gives us more fear of the Lord because we understand more about Him and the world that He made. And so then that feeds us back into more wisdom because we have a deeper appreciation for God and His character and His creation. So you see how this works. And this is what we're talking about when we say that wisdom is a skill that is rooted in the fear of the Lord and is in a desire to learn. And so it is a skill that helps us to get better at that skill, which helps us to grow in that skill, and it feeds on itself. And in a similar way, this is mentioned on your handout, folly does the same thing because folly rejects God. It does not honor Him and glorify Him. And so maybe like in the language of Romans 1, God gives us over and we go into our folly and we go into a darkened understanding, which then leads us to appreciate God even less. We know less about Him. We have a more twisted view of Him. And so we reject Him even more, pushing us into further folly. And that can be as a downward spiral as well. But wisdom and the fear of the Lord works upward and upward to more light, to more life, and to better living. And so with all of that said, I was hoping to get to this a little bit earlier so we'd have more time to talk about it. But let's read chapter 3 of Proverbs, at least the first 12 verses. A familiar section in Proverbs, but let's read it and think about the questions on the screen as we read. The blessings of wise living, the limitations that are placed on the wise man, and the areas of life that wisdom finds its expression. Proverbs 3, 1-12. My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. Do not let kindness and truth leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. So you will find favor and good repute in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your body and refreshment to your bones. Honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all your produce. So your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine. My son, do not reject the discipline of the Lord or loathe His reproof. For whom the Lord loves, He disciplines, even as a father corrects the son in whom He delights. This gives a beautiful description of wisdom, how wisdom leads to so much blessing and fullness in the life of a person who lives by it. But living by wisdom means subjecting yourself to God's knowledge, to God's truth, to His law, to His commandments, to His instruction. It means constraining yourself in that way, which we don't like. But the person who adheres to God's wisdom, to His understanding, to His knowledge, and does that in every area of life. Try to refrain from this too much because I keep saying it in our worldview lesson. But true wisdom in God finds its expression in every part of our life. You see that here in Proverbs 3. He says, in all your ways acknowledge Him, but he also talks about things like when we make money and we have wealth, everything we do should be in honor of God and animated by His wisdom. And as we live well in every aspect of our life under the confines of God's knowledge, God's truth, God's kindness, God's law, God's wisdom, then we live well and we have a fullness of life that everybody longs for, but is only truly possible in the fear of the Lord and in the living by wisdom. So that's a beautiful passage that you can meditate on more going forward. But we will close with this, which is 2 discussion questions. So if you're with people, friends or family or others tonight or when you're watching this, here's some things that you can discuss following the video. Is there a perfect wise man or a perfect fool? What we mean by that is somebody absolutely 100% in the category of wise or 100% in the category of fool. Is there a perfect wise man or a foolish person? Depending on how you answer that, how then are we to understand the passages in which we have the contrast between wise man and the fool? How do we understand that if maybe there's not such a thing as a perfect wise person or a perfect fool? And then number two is using the definition of wisdom that we've come up with in this class, list some ways in which we act foolishly. So let's talk about practically ways that we demonstrate folly based on the definitions that we've put forth in this class. So you can take some time to discuss that if you would like to, but this class is over and I will leave the questions up on the screen for a little while. But we thank you for watching and invite you to join us for our next class.